continue on in this series. We've been looking at Elijah and Elisha. We've finished on Elijah. We've looked at his life. And we started in on Elisha last week, look at his calling, asked some very specific questions for you to look at. What is God calling you to do in your life, and are you following that call? And I got to tell you, though, it's a little harder to preach on Elisha than it is Elijah, okay? Remember last week I told you Elijah is man, he was that fiery guy, so he was up sometimes and down sometimes and all in between, and there was so much, it's so easy to kind of preach on Elijah. Elisha is a steady guy, which is great, but sometimes it makes it a little harder to preach on Elisha because of his steadiness. So as we go through this series, and this second half of the series, we're going to be looking at Elisha, and it's a lot of the work is revolved around the miracles that he performed. Remember last week I told you that he asked for a double portion, and how did we see that he received the double portion? How was it? Oh, come on, everybody. Don't fall asleep at this point. Okay, by the miracles, because Elijah performed 14 miracles, and Elisha performed 28. So he got the double portion, okay? It's a neat way of looking at it. There's other ways to see it also, but that's a neat way to look at it. So today we're going to be looking at, the title of the message today is From Bitterness to Blessing. From bitterness to blessing. Now, I'm going to tell you, this is going to be a little bit different today. We're going to look at this Old Testament passage, and we're going to look at what happened in the city of Jericho. But when we apply it to our lives today, we're going to apply it in a little bit of a different way. And the whole idea is bitterness to blessing. Okay, so stick with me. We're going to look at this. The problem we want to consider today, the problem we're looking at today is a very serious one. The problem we're looking at today is that problem of bitterness. Bitterness. You see, bitterness is going to eliminate joy in your life every single time. Bitterness is going to leave you in a very dark place. It'll destroy all kinds of things. It'll destroy individuals, marriages, families. Bitterness even destroys churches, by the way. Bitterness can show itself in many different ways, but we need to understand that most bitter people are bitter because they have an unforgiving spirit. People who are bitter usually are very harsh and critical and judgmental, not of themselves, but of others, you know. It's always easy to be judgmental of others. By the way, bitter people can cause a lot of harm to themselves, to other people, and to the followers of Jesus. And by the way, bitterness can cause a lot of problems and harm to the cause of Christ. If you are a follower of Jesus, yet you're harboring bitterness and living a life of bitterness, you are not sharing the love of Christ in the way you're called to do it. And that is causing harm to the overall cause of Christ. Here's a couple of different preachers use different terminologies. Some would say, we're going to talking today about bitter believers, okay? These are all alliterated, okay? You know I love that. Bitter believers. Others say they're sour saints. I like that one, sour saints. And then another one says, this is more modern, caustic Christians. Wow. That's what we're talking about today. Christians who suffer with the problem of bitterness in their hearts, and their joy is taken away, and they are not showing forth the love of Christ. Bitterness is usually caused by hurt. Someone hurt you along the way. Someone hurt you along the way, and because of that, and it's not resolved, then you become a person with a root of bitterness, and that poisonous soil of bitterness is in there. By the way, we've all been hurt in life, right? Every head should be nodding now, you know? And by the way, if you haven't been hurt today, just wait, you know? It's part of life. God never said you would not be hurt. Hurt is part of life. And one guy said it this way, it's all about how you're going to respond to that hurt. It can make you bitter or it can make you better. And the choice is yours. And today when we look at this whole idea of bitterness that's a choice. Someone's hurt you. Okay, I understand. And it's a serious hurt. But if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you have got to have the attitude of forgiveness and work through it and resolve it and let it make you better as a person. Bitter people refuse to deal with the problem and harbor hostility in their heart. And by the way, they begin to justify it. That's the other thing that's interesting. As a pastor, I've counseled many people for years. Well, Pastor, I have the right to be hurt. I have the right to be bitter. Because they did this to me 45 years ago, I'm still bitter about it today. Really? Really? No. Not at all. That's not the way God wants you to live. God wants you to live with bitterness all your life? Absolutely not. He wants you to live a better life, learn to forgive, because you're going to be hurt all along the way. So learn to forgive. By the way, if you're looking for something to be bitter about, there's always something to be bitter about. You know, people come to church sometimes looking to something to just gripe and complain at church. And by the way, by the end of the day, you'll find something, all right? It'll happen. You can start with the preacher because the preacher sat down instead of stood up, you know? You can start with the preacher. Why? Because I'm sinful just like everybody else. None of us are perfect. And so don't let this root of bitterness. In fact, Hebrews 12:15 says it this way. Look out for each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Listen to this last part. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you. Hebrews 12:15. That no poisonous root of bitterness troubles you. It calls bitterness a root here. Most roots grow underground, right? So I know we don't have a lot of grass here in Tucson, Arizona, but sometimes we have what we call weeds, you know, those green things that we let grow because we like to have some green stuff grow. But the reality is we ought to pull those weeds out. What's the best way to get rid of weeds? One guy said salt, the other service, but here's what I want to say to you. Pull it out by its roots, right? Because then it won't grow back. That's the same way with bitterness. You have to deal with it at the root. The passage we look at today, we're going to be looking at the Old Testament city of Jericho and understand why there was bitterness in that city, in the fact of the water. But as we apply it to our lives today, we're going to apply it to us and be careful that we don't have bitterness in our own lives. Elijah, by the way, or Elisha, has just been anointed by God as the new prophet. He performed his first miracle. He threw the cloak, Elijah's cloak, down on the Jordan River. It split open. He walks back across. And as he's coming back across, there's Jericho on the other side. And you can believe the word got there fast. There's a new sheriff in town. Remember, I said that last week. New sheriff in town. His name is Elisha. And so he's headed to Jericho, the first city there. He gets to Jericho. And when he gets there, the leaders of the town come to him and say, hey, we've got a problem here. Can you help us fix it? So let me read the passage. One day, the leaders of the town of Jericho visited Elisha. We have a problem, they told him. This town is located in pleasant surroundings, as you can see, but the water is bad and the land is unproductive. Elisha said, bring me a new bowl with salt in it. So they brought it to him. And then he went out to the spring that was supplied the town with water, and he threw the salt in it. And he said this is what the Lord says, I have purified this water. It will no longer cause death or infertility. And the water has remained pure ever since that day, just as Elisha said. So let's look at this passage for a minute. Let's turn bitterness into blessing. So first we need to understand the condition that was going on in the city of Jericho, all right? Verse 19 tells us three very specific things about the city of Jericho. The condition of Jericho, first of all, it was a beautiful city. A beautiful city. At first glance, the city looked prosperous. At first glance, there were beautiful buildings, there were trees, there were gardens, there was all kinds of activity going on. Some of your translations say it was a pleasant situation or a pleasant city. From the outside appearance, the outward appearance, everything looked great. The soil was rich. The climate was great, no 110-degree weather like we had yesterday. The side of the city was in a beautiful place, very delightful. You know, if somebody were considering where to live in that day and time, Jericho would be at the top of their list, you know. Realtors in the city of Jericho were probably going crazy, man. They were selling properties left and right because it was a pleasant city. It was a great place to live, at least on the outward appearance. By the way, what are the pleasant places or the popular places to live today? For millennials, it's Austin and Denver. So Austin and Denver, that's where people like to go these days. That's where all the jobs are going. That's where people are running to. And let me just put third on that list, Tucson, okay? And if you believe that, I can be glad to sell you some property. Tucson is not up on the top of the list, although I love living in Tucson. I think it's great. But that's not the popular places for today. Austin and Denver are those places. So Jericho's kind of like those cities. Everybody's going to go there because outward appearance, it looks great. And by the way, the world looks at the outward appearance, right? That's what the world's always looking for. People are always looking for this, the picture-perfect place. That's what they want. You know why? Because they want to do a selfie and put it on Facebook. See my new digs? Aren't they beautiful? I live in Jericho. Where do you live? That's what they're doing. They want to come to Jericho because it's a beautiful place on the outside. And Facebook and Instagram and all these things have all these beautiful pictures, but that's not the thing that's going on because it says the water was bitter and bad. And because the water was bitter and bad, it was unfruitful land. Things didn't grow. Well, they would grow, but they wouldn't produce. So on the outside, it was beautiful, but on the inside, it was barren. The ground was barren. Nothing was happening. In fact, some of your translations, the different words here for barren, but the root word here is the word that they used in the Old Testament for miscarriage, to have a miscarriage. Doesn't mean that nothing would grow. It just means that what did grow, the plants, the shoots, the seeds, they would come up out of the ground and they would not produce fruit. Or when they produced fruit, it was horrible fruit. And by the way, in that day and time, crops were everything, right? They were an agricultural society. Crops were everything. And if there were no crops, that meant there were no food. And if there was no food, there was no livelihood. Jericho looked great on the outside. It was a beautiful city, but on the inside, it was barren. There were no crops. I don't know why they're moving there. I'd be moving away. But people were moving there. Also, remember, Jericho was the original city that they attacked when they came across the Jordan River. Remember when the children of Israel were taking the promised land, they come across the Jordan River, and there's Jericho, and that's the first battle, right? The Battle of Jericho. And they win the battle, and it's kind of like a reminder and a setting saying, the Lord saying, I helped you win this battle, we're moving forward. Here's another thing a lot of times we forget. As they moved out of Jericho on into the rest of the promised land, God left a curse on the city of Jericho. We forget that. It's found in Joshua chapter 6, verse 26. Listen as I read it. At the time, Joshua invoked this curse. May the curse of the Lord fall on anyone who tries to rebuild the town of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest son, he will build its gates. In modern technology words, that's strong. He's saying, you want to rebuild Jericho? I told you to leave it alone. You'll lose your firstborn if you do it. And yet now, many years later, it's filled with people again. They didn't listen to God, did they? Well, don't get down on them. We don't listen to God most of the time either, do we? Oh, we didn't like that. Okay, now you're mad at the preacher. The beautiful on the outside, barren on the inside. Why? Because the water was bitter. The water was bitter. In your translations, the word bad, it can mean worthless or nothingness. The idea is it's bitter water. Have you ever tasted bitter water? Did you know that bitter water water has different tastes? There are some good water and some bad water. In fact, not long ago, Diana bought some water for the bottled water for the office because we keep a lot of bottled water there. And she bought one brand, and I don't remember what it is now, and I said, don't ever buy that one again. Yeah, it tasted horrible. In fact, anytime she buys it, we just send it over to the kitchen and let them use it over there because it may not be bitter to anybody else, but I don't like that water, and I can't remember the brand, whatever it is now. I know Diana knows what it is, but I can't remember. But water has different taste. And we know in this case, it was bitter water that was the problem. Why? Because Elisha goes there to solve the problem. That's where he goes. And before we go on to the next part, let me just remind you again, the world, again, is just looking at the outside of everything. The outward appearance, the smile, the looking great. Let me look the best I can. That's why, remember last week I told you I had the surgery and I had a nose job and a facelift. Nobody noticed, you know. The reality is people do lots of money for plastic surgery. Why? So they look good on the outside. But on the inside, they're filled with bitterness. They're filled with emptiness. What good is it to look great on the outside when there's nothing on the inside? That's what the city was in this situation. It reminded me of 1 Timothy 4:8. Physical training is good, but listen to this, but training for godliness is so much better. Now, it doesn't say that physical training is bad. You can go work out, you can get a facelift, you can do that. I'm not saying it's wrong to do that, but it's nothing compared to spiritual training. Because if you look great on the outside and have a great selfie with a smile on, but inside you're bitter and empty, it means nothing to God. And by the way, you can look good on a selfie on Instagram, but God knows what's inside. He knows what's happening on the inside. So let's look at the remedy for Jericho. First of all, the only hope is in God. God was their only hope. And we need to give credit to the leaders of Jericho because they recognized that. They saw Elisha coming and they realized that Elisha was the new sheriff in town. They realized that he spoke for God and he had already performed a miracle. And they're like, we need to go to Elisha because he's the representation of God right now. And we need to ask him. So these leaders of Jericho knew exactly where to go. They recognized the authenticity of Elisha as the true prophet of God. And they came to him. And Elisha says, give me a new bowl, put salt in it, let's go to the spring. We'll get back to that in just a minute. I want you to understand something. The only hope for you today and for the world today is Jesus Christ. It's the only hope for anything and everything. But as we narrow it down today to the whole idea of your bitterness, the only hope of any bitterness or emptiness in your life is Jesus Christ. You know, we're getting all worked up because an election is coming. You know? Your hope is not in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or the Independents. Your hope is not in the economy of the United States of America. Your hope is not if we live in a democracy or if we live in a dictatorship. None of that really matters. Jesus is your only hope. And if you have all these other wonderful things, it's pleasant on the outside and empty on the inside because it's filled with bitterness. The only hope is Jesus. The men of Jericho, here's what I don't understand is, why did it take them so long to figure this out? Do you know that from the curse in Joshua 6 to when they went to Elisha, it's been over 500 years. 500 years. And all this time, they've tried their own things. Oh, I'm sure they made potions and threw it in the water. They went through rituals to cure the water. They tried all kinds of things, but none of it worked. And they finally come to God because they knew that he's the only one that could help them, and he's the only hope. But before you get too down on them, remember, you and I do the same thing, don't we? We try everything we can to solve our bitterness, solve our problems, but it's not until we realize that Jesus is the only hope that it'll happen. The remedy is Jesus. Here's the second one on that. God has the answer to all their problems. God's the one that has the answers. And by the way, God always has the answers to your problems, right? He never fails. He is always there. He promises to always be there. So Elisha says, bring me a bowl, fill it with salt, and he goes to the springs and he throws the salt in the water, and he says, this is what the Lord says, I have purified this water. No longer will it cause death and infertility. Now it's going to be fruitful. But I want you to notice something. Elisha didn't say, give me this bowl and give me this salt. Oh, where's the fields of irrigation? Or where are the buckets where you keep the water? Or where are the bowls that you keep the water? He didn't do any of that. We're tempted to go there. He went straight to the source, to the spring. That's what we've got to do, is go straight to the source of the problem, not play around with the symptoms, go straight to the source. And by the way, we need to remember this. This was a miracle of God, okay? Before we forget this, one of those 28 miracles that Elisha performs, it's a miracle of God, and Elisha is very careful to give God the credit. He doesn't go around saying, hey, I did this. Now you need to pay me because you're going to be fruitful as a land. He didn't do any of that. He says, God's the one. God said the water is healed. It's a miracle of God. And God had the answer to their problems. And today, God has the answer to your problems as well. And if your problem is a life of bitterness, God can help you. God has the answers. He wants to help you, but he's waiting for you to come to him, just like they had to come to Elisha. And just like Elisha had to throw the salt into the spring source, God's waiting to say, hey, I've got the answer to your problems, to your bitterness, to your emptiness, but you have to come to me. The remedy of Jericho. Then we see the results of Jericho. The water was healed. And it says the water remained pure ever since. The same stream, have you ever been to the beginnings of a stream? Have you ever been there? One time traveling in Brazil, we went to this one mountain region, and we were staying in this mountain house, and there's a fresh spring going along. And so we decided, let's go all the way to we hiked for like 5 or 6 miles, and we finally found it. But it's so cool. It's just bubbling up out of the ground. There it is. But he went to the source and found that fresh spring. It's the same spring, same water, but now it is no longer bitter because God has healed the water. Same spring going. And by the way, that spring is still there today. It's called the spring of Elisha. I Google mapped it the other day. It's there. I saw it. And by the way, the fields around it are all bright and green. That water was healed by God and still is healed by God even to this day. Your healing for your bitterness comes from him. And then the land was fruitful. That was the other thing. Fruitful to this day. You want a solution to the bitterness? You want to be fruitful in your life? You want your life to mean something, to count something? Remember we talked about that last week? What's God's call on your life? If you really want it to mean something, you're going to have to get rid of that bitterness and that emptiness, and you have to come to him because he will heal you and make you fruitful for him. Now let me do some application before we go to the Lord's Supper. Bitterness results in spiritual barrenness. Spiritual barrenness will always be a part of bitterness. If you're going to hold on to bitterness, there are so many Christians in this world today that they look so pleasant on the outside, and there's nothing on the inside. And by the way, you can't be fruitful for the Lord if you're that way. You may look great, but God says, I can't use you. You're a bitter spring on the inside. I can't use you because there's this deep-seated bitterness that's messing you up. And I want you to be fruitful in this life and the life to come, but you have to forgive and be forgiven. Bitterness always results in spiritual barrenness. The second one is bitterness must be dealt with at the source. Must be dealt with at the very beginning. You have to get it. Remember, it said the root of bitterness in Hebrews. In fact, I know this may be a little gross, but it reminded me of my surgery just a few weeks ago. So I have what it's called inverted papilloma. It's a benign tumor that grows in my sinus cavities, okay? So I had this surgery 9 years ago. It's all over the place. They got it all out. But here's what the doctor said. It will grow back. So the doctor this time said, here's what I want to do. I want to get at the root of the tumor. So you know what he did? Hold on. That's why I'm having headaches. He drills on the bone right here to drill down the bone to see if he can get that root out. That's what he did. No promises, he says. Thanks a lot. But when I saw that, it's like the root of bitterness. To get it out, you've got to get it out by the roots. And to get it out by the roots, you've got to go to the source of the problem right at the very beginning. Don't try to treat the symptoms. Go straight to the source. And here's another one. Allow God to change your bitterness into blessing. People spend millions of dollars on psychiatrists and therapists and psychologists, and that's all okay. But when it comes to bitterness, eventually, essentially, only God can help you with that because it's a forgiveness problem. And only God can forgive, ultimately. I want to challenge you today. Would you be willing to say, as David said, Search me, O God. Search me, O God. See if there's anything in my life. Let me finish with this as we change into the Lord's Supper time. The reason why I think this is so important to see this is in Matthew 5:13, Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth." But what good is the salt if it loses its flavor? Can you make it salty again? No, it's only worth being thrown out and trampled underfoot. We're the salt of the earth. But if we're filled with bitterness, we're that flavorless salt that's only worth being thrown out. So I challenge you today to be salty for God. Listen to me. You got to let the Lord sweeten your bitterness. You like that? A little play on words? You're going to remember that one? If you want to be the salt of the earth and be salty for God, it can only happen if you allow God to sweeten your bitterness. If you will ask for forgiveness and be forgiven. Will you bow with me?